Well, maybe I'll just kick off by saying welcome to everyone. We have a great speaker today. There's a few more future speakers that are popping up the screen there that'll come in February and April. And I think without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mike Moffat.
Thank you, Bob. And it's great to see everybody today. We're really blessed today to have Dr. David Peterson share some of his time to speak with us. Dr. Peterson's an Ohio native, born here in Cleveland, and he's also a Case alumnus. He earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees, all in biomedical engineering here at Case, the latter with Dr. Tom Mortimer as his advisor. In fact, many of you are familiar with the Peterson electrode, having studied it as part of your work here at Case. Dave started his industry career at Medtronic working in cardiac rhythm management systems, and was the system architect for the first Medtronic dual chamber implantable cardioverter defibrillator. And he was awarded the prestigious Bakken Fellowship Award for his work during his years at Medtronic. In the late 90s, Dave wanted to get back to his neural roots and joined Advanced Bionics, which is now the neuromodulation division of Boston Scientific, where he served as a director and senior director. And while he was there, Dave architected 2 generations of multiple current source stimulation systems that are still today continuing as the most advanced SCS and DBS stimulation output architectures that are on the market. And it was there that I had the benefit of being mentored by Dave and learned that he's not only a great engineer, but a great person. A couple of the things that he taught me were, one, we're all in sales, Mike. We all have to be able to tell our story. A second one was, as I started to manage people, he said, don't over-constrain your team, let them create. And I sure appreciated his mentorship. In 2012, Dave joined Valencia Technologies as the Chief Technology Officer, and he remains a member of the board today. And while there, he architected the eCoin stimulator that we're going to hear about today. Dave is presently the head of product development at Galvani Bioelectronics, working surely on some exciting systems that are yet to be disclosed that we'll look forward to hearing about in the future. And with that, Dave, I'll turn the mic over to you, and we'll look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Wow, that's a kind introduction, Mike. Appreciate the kind words. Let me see if I can talk this into showing my screen. Had a little flipping of the screen. Is everybody seeing my screen and hearing me okay?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, just to kind of carry on with what Mike is saying, the things that I'm going to talk about today are part of the work that's going on at Valencia Technologies, which I maintain an affiliation with as part of the board. Nothing that I'm going to talk about today has anything to do with my present role at Galvani Bioelectronics. Kind of to get to some of the disclaimers, I am a board member. I'm also a shareholder at Valencia Technologies. And then the things that I'm going to be talking about today, the eCoin for tibial nerve stimulation, it's an investigational device only. It's not approved for sale in any country. They're working on that. We'll talk a little bit about some of the pivotal trial work, but it's not available commercially. With that, you know, I'll kind of jump in. I think this is not something that a lot of folks need to hear. You probably know a lot about bladder control much more than I do, but this application is focused on urinary urge incontinence. It affects about 16% of American adults, and we're talking about urgency, frequency of urgency, and then urge incontinence, or leaks, and then nocturia, which is night leaks. So this is sort of the symptoms. These are the things that we go after and look at in our endpoints. the thing about incontinence is it does predispose patients to other health problems, bladder infections, depression, isolation, and it is a source of dependency among the elderly. So it's, there's a lot of comorbidities associated with incontinence. And with the large population of folks that are treated by this, there is a lot of effort that's going into the treatment armamentarium. So, and by the way, I think if you were investing in diapers, you would want to invest in adult diapers, not in infant diapers. And it's surprising to me to know that the market for adult diapers is actually larger than it is for infant diapers. Just to give you an idea how prevalent this problem is. So in terms of treatments, the first line they're called behavioral, but it really involves bladder training and control strategies, pelvic floor muscle training, even fluid management. And these are kind of the first tier. They're moderately effective. The second tier is pharmaceutical, and these include antimuscarinics, oral beta-3 androreceptor agents, oxybutynin injections and patches. The pharmaceutical approach for UUIs it's moderately effective, but it's not well tolerated. There's not about a 2.8% penetration, and most patients stop after a year. It just isn't, the side effects don't warrant the benefit that they get. So the third line, now you're getting into maybe a little more invasive, if you don't consider pharmaceuticals invasive. As an engineer, I do, but they include Botox for bladder injections, peripheral tibial nerve stimulation. Actually, that's percutaneous is what I call it. And then sort of the last piece of the tier is sacral neuromodulation, which has been around a long time. And each of these presents its own unique challenges in terms of side effects for the patient. In the case of bladder injections, you get infections, and a lot of the problems you solve with the urge incontinence, you end up with elevated residual and retention, which is sort of the opposite side, and that happens. Percutaneous tibial nerve stimulation, the challenge there is that you have to go in to get this treatment in a doctor's office. It involves placing a needle close to the tibial nerve, so you do get a procedure. It's very operator dependent, and then from a compliance perspective, you're going back. You need this. There is a carryover effect with tibial nerve stimulation, but you need to do it, at least once a week or more, in order to maintain its efficacy. And then sacral neuromodulation, you're talking about a full-blown implant. This is an electrode placed on the S3 nerve. You have to go through the foramen and then the sacral foramen, and then place that electrode there. You're going to have all the classical problems with an implant, everything from infection to lead migration to lead fracture and problems at the implant site. And then managing these devices is, kind of par you in terms of programming and follow-up is involved. So maybe to kind of summarize, and for what's available today for neuromodulation, you've got sort of the tibial nerve stimulation side. That includes the percutaneous that we talked about, where a needle is put close to the nerve. A stimulator has an indifferent patch placed near there. This is typically done in an office. You can do transcutaneous tibial nerve stimulation, and what's attractive about that is this is something a patient could conceivably do at home. The problem is you are going through the skin, and the activation of the tibial nerve is challenging with this type of system, but it has been used. And then sacral neuromodulation, which has been around since the 70s, late 70s. It involves, as I said, an electrode placed on the S3 nerve. You've got to go through the foramen. It's a pretty touchy procedure in that you need to get your electrode array right on that nerve. But it does work, but you're getting an implant. These devices are available now and rechargeable, so that saves you from having to replace the battery. The power requirements for this are quite low compared to, say, other neuromodulation techniques. So a battery that can run 10 years or more is not atypical in this space, but you still do have to manage the device. So this is awful, but I kind of needed to talk a little bit about what we sort of understand about how tibial nerve stimulation works, which is not a whole lot. We understand that the tibial nerve has afferents that go through to L3 and S3, and those are the same sacral nerves that are used for sacral nerve neuromodulation. The thinking here is the mechanism is a little different. What is observed with tibial nerve stimulation is that low frequencies seem to have more of an excitatory effect, but if you run in the 6 to 20 and maybe even 30 hertz, there appears to be an inhibitory effect wherein the bladder is expanded. You're able to achieve higher bladder volumes before initiating the micturition reflex, and that's been shown in animal models as well as in tests in humans. The other piece in terms of tibial nerve stimulation is that it appears that you increase the tone in the internal and external sphincters. So that also helps with retention. And there's, again, probably more that's not really fully understood about this, but what we do know is with a 6 to 20 hertz stimulation at the tibial nerve, we get an inhibitory effect. And that inhibitory effect seems to carry over. So you don't need to stimulate continuously. Now, sacral nerve stimulation is a continuous therapy, a 24/7 type of therapy. I don't know that you couldn't get a carryover effect with that. To be honest, I think that in the case of tibial nerve stimulation, we're more interested in a carryover effect because as a practical matter, whether it's percutaneous tibial nerve stimulation, where you've got to go into the office to get the stimulation or apply a patch if you're doing it at home, or even if you're talking about an implanted stimulator, it needs to be very, very small. There's significant benefits to being able to deliver the therapy with low duty cycles. And so the therapy that's typically prescribed for tibial nerve stimulation is 30-minute sessions. So a period of 30 minutes of stimulation. We use a 20 hertz rate and a 0.2 millisecond pulse width. So we give those stimulation doses once every 3 to 4 days, depending on where we are in the treatment. So initially a higher dose rate and then relaxing that. And that enables really the smaller sizes of these devices, and it seems to be effective, I think. So moving on a little to the anatomy. So why would we put an electrode or a device down in the lower leg when we want to activate the tibial nerve? And we've already said that the site of activation is in the roots, or why aren't we closer? And the reason is the tibial nerve is available down in the lower leg. It becomes quite superficial, a branch of it at least. It's, if you kind of look on the inside of the leg, you can kind of see in yellow, that's the tibial nerve coming down. It's fairly superficial. It's a little easier to see if you look at this in cross section, where in this cross section, the toes of the right leg are pointed out towards you, and so you're looking kind of at the medial side of the leg where the tibial nerve is, and you can kind of see it's mostly soft tissue along the side of it in the lower leg. And again, it's accessible. You have the possibility either with a needle for percutaneous stimulation or with a device to access that space. So this is the surgical procedure that the Leadless system uses. Something I didn't mention, in terms of Leadless and relative to complications, a Leadless device has an advantage that you eliminate a major source of complications. About 80% of if you kind of go into a MOD database and look at a lot of neuromodulation devices, about 80% of them over time are lead related, either dislodgement, breakage, or around that. So being able to get rid of that wire, and those of you that have worked in the space, kind of understand how beneficial that is. So we're really looking at placing a coin-sized device that sits right over the nerve, close to it, but not in direct contact. So moving back to the surgical procedure, you have a really great landmark for this. It's the medial malleosis. It's a bump on your ankle. We all kind of know about it if you ever go skiing. That's the thing that hurts when you ski. But that high point, if you do a mark about 3 centimeters posterior to that, and then you go up about 3 centimeters, you're right at where you want to put our device. And so you can actually mark that out in a pre-surgical prep. The implant procedure itself then involves an incision that's actually not over the device. You don't want to do that. You want the incision away from it, because when it heals, you want that not to be affected by the device itself. The device will provide some tension on the skin, as well as there'll be some swelling. So putting your incision up there, which, by the way, was when I worked with Dr. Sen on developing this technique, he educated me on this. I was kind of like, oh wow, why have we been putting pockets so close to our devices? So this incision goes there. You then are able to blunt dissect down to where you actually want the unit. So it's a subcutaneous implant. And then there's a little tool that we've got that you can load the device in and then insert it into the pocket and then leave it in place. And then again, you suture that incision closed. That's where the infection is going to come in, and having that again away from the device where it's hopefully minimally affected, it can be a clean heal, is something that is beneficial. So this is something you can do in an outpatient or an in-office procedure. It's local anesthesia. You don't need to put anyone under general. In the trials that we've done, it's been on an average of 20 minutes from the initial incision to the final suture. It's a pretty quick procedure that we can do. If I now move on a little bit to the device, this is the coin, just some specifications for it. It's about the size of a nickel, maybe a little bit bigger, millimeter or so in diameter, a little thicker. This particular embodiment is a little thicker because we wanted to put a little bit of a larger battery on it. There was an earlier embodiment of it that we were using for blood pressure that was a little thinner, but this is about 3.2 millimeters thick, still quite thin compared to a lot of medical systems implants. The electrodes in this system are platinum, and the cathode is that center disc. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, if that helps, but this is where the cathode is. And then the anode is a ring that goes around the outside edge of the coin. And a couple of neat things about that. One, we only need one feed through in this system. This is actually an active CAN device where the CAN itself is the cathode, and then we isolate the current through through this platinum disc by insulating the rest of the housing with silicone rubber. A single feed through, and then this ring that serves as the anode, it provides what I would say is a radially symmetric field. That means you don't need to worry a little bit too much about the orientation of this. So you just need to get this point here as close to, but not directly on the tibial nerve. So that's sort of how that's set up. As I mentioned, the stimulation parameters are 0.2 milliseconds, 20 pulses a second. And the output for this device ranges from 0.5 milliampere to 15 milliamperes. 8 is sort of typical, around 8 milliamperes is where you tend to set this device up. And then the therapy is 30 minutes every 4 days. For the first 18 weeks, the device is pre-configured to deliver therapy every 3 days. And this is all automatic. You could program this stuff and play with it, but there really isn't a lot of value. The only thing that really gets adjusted in this device is you turn it on and you adjust the amplitude. So it's as far as how you set it up from a clinical perspective, it's pretty simple. It uses a lithium battery, and the service life can range from 1.5 or so to 7 years, but you're going to be typically looking at a 3-year service life with a device like this before it has to be replaced. The external controller is kind of interesting. It's used to turn the device on and off. It actually is essentially a toroid coil magnet that's electrically activated that creates essentially a DC magnet field. It does a lot of the things that a magnet would do, but we pulse it at a rate that allows us to communicate with the device. And you go, well, why would you do that? There's a lot of current that's in that external device. Well, it lets us put a really tiny magnet sensor inside the implant. If you're talking about an RF or any kind of antenna system, you've got to at least have an antenna, and then you got to have the demodulation circuitry and so forth for that. And even if you do a tremendous job of that, the volume of that can be considerable. Well, a magnetic sensor only takes about a cubic millimeter in your device. There's just not many communication systems that can do that. So I thought that in terms of kind of a neat way to use sort of old technology, that was kind of a neat thing we did here. There's also a patient magnet for this that's principally to turn off the therapy if there's a problem. We didn't want the patient going home and not being able to disable the therapy if there was a problem. But so the external controller is really designed for clinician use to turn it off and adjust the amplitudes. Oops. So this is sort of what it looks like inside the device. It's a hermetic sealed device, titanium housing, a PCBA with a very thin, flexible organic substrate. All the devices, all the components in this are they're not so much commercial grade, but they are commercially available components. There's no custom components. Valencia was not financed in a way that we could go hire an ASIC team or anything, and we did pretty good getting everything we needed for a single channel stimulator into this tiny little can. As I said, it uses a lithium battery. Because it's hermetically sealed and you're using organic materials inside the device, although we bake out the materials and pull the moisture out before we seal it, there's always residual moisture and outgassing. So we put a hygroscopic getter in the device that's designed to stabilize the moisture inside of it over the life of the unit. And as I said, there's a single feed through. We weld the top of the can on. Then we weld on the platinum ring. We weld on the cathode, the disc electrode, and then over that goes the silicone insulation. So there's an overmolding process. And that silicone insulation not only isolates the electricity to go through the platinum disc electrode, but it also provides a kind of a soft and a little layer of compliance that's comfortable for the patient. So it feels a little, if you pick up one of these, they feel kind of soft, even though they're a coin, they're not as hard and rigid. And what you have in contact then with tissue is direct contact with tissue is silicone, rubber, and platinum. For those of you might be interested in kind of the charge density that we use on a system like this, it ends up being about 60 microcoulombs per centimeter squared. We use a charge balance waveform, kind of the usual stuff, passive recovery. So well within the acceptable limits for platinum. You could probably go up to 100 or so with this electrode. And we have versions of the device that do provide a little more current, but this is what we needed for the OAB application. The other thing about it is the compliance voltage on this is about 15 volts, which is plenty for the type of tissue we're going to encounter. And this is sort of what one looks like when you open it up in real life. And you can kind of see power regulator. This is a current regulated device. So we actually have a current regulated component in there that does that. It uses a very small microcontroller. Pretty low power, pretty easy to work. It has EM protection for cautery as well as other types of sources of external interference. We talked a little bit about that in external controller command sensor. That's that little tiny thing. You can even see it, but that's all we need to talk to this device. Like I said, it's pretty cool. There's then an output capacitor. This output capacitor is configured in, I don't know if some of you are familiar with the Bion type topology, where that output capacitor both stores the charge that we're pumping into the system, but it also provides a DC isolation of the outputs. And that's that. So this is, again, with this group is embarrassing to put in. You know, when you're working in a startup and you're trying to figure out how to design a device, sometimes you don't have the best tools. And you also don't have all the information you need to understand how to configure your coin in terms of making sure that it stimulates well. And so when I was posed with this question, I was working in a field that was mostly associated with needles, electroacupuncture needles. And I could understand from the literature that if you got a needle within 1.5 millimeters of the nerve, you could do a great job of activating it. And so once I sort of knew that, and I knew the geometry of the needle, and I could assume the tissues were similar for both, I could go ahead and compute an activating function around the needle and figure out what that activating function looked like 1.5 millimeters from the needle, and then apply that in a very crude way to the disc electrode that I was going to use. And so what this is showing is a transverse look at an activating function. It's really a normalized activating function. So the nerve would be looking into and coming out of this electrode, or out of this picture. And then the eCoin device, the cartoon of that, sort of shows you where the cathode is. And then that isopotential here, or iso activating function, I guess is a better word, right here between the light blue and the burgundy, is sort of what you would see from in terms of an activating function if you were 1.5 millimeters away from a needle. And you know, this is not the sophisticated modeling that a lot of us do, but it was enough to tell me that we were in the ballpark of what we needed to do to get a nerve. If you could get it within a few millimeters of this cathode, you were going to be able to do about what you could do with a needle. And that's about as far as I needed to take it to say, yeah, I think we're on the right track here. So this is engineering, which is, you know, the art of good enough. And this is sort of how we figure that out to do that. So the next thing is, we talked about the longevity. This is obviously very sensitive to the settings. If you're up near 15 milliamperes, you're only going to get a device that lasts about 1.5 years. If you're lucky enough to be down near 2, you could be over 5 years. But typically we're going to be in this 8 milliampere range, which is around 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years, what the device can supply. And that's with these parameters. So that's a little bit about the device. I was going to move on into kind of some of the things for the clinical trials next. We can wait for questions at the end, or if there's any kind of questions about that before I move on to the next step. What do you think? Just move on? Okay. So these are some of the studies that have been done. I put links in here to the clinicaltrials.gov. There has been a feasibility study done with this eCoin system for tibial nerve stimulation. It's a 46 participant patient, and the initial study and then the follow-on study covers about 12 months of tibial nerve stimulation, and those are the 2 papers that were published and associated with that. What I was going to maybe talk about is the pivotal study results. That was with 133 participants. These are both open label studies. As a lot of us know, doing randomized controlled studies where you're trying to blind patients to the presence of stimulation is a real challenging thing to do. So you do have that limitation. And in the pivotal study, it was intended to be a year study, but because the implant is done and then 4 weeks later we turn on the stimulator, it's only 48 weeks of tibial nerve stimulation, but a 12-month study. And so I was going to talk a little bit about the pivotal study and kind of the results, and this is a link to the paper. So the primary efficacy outcome that was used in this was to get a 50% reduction in leaks compared to baseline at 48 weeks post-activation. And then the primary safety outcome of the study was an assessment of any device-related adverse events at that same 48-week post-activation endpoint. There were some secondary outcomes that were looking at the episode ratios at 24 weeks post-activation, and there was also some reductions from baseline and the other measures, which are voids, urgency, and nocturia at 24 weeks. Those were taken at 24 weeks. And then the patients did keep a diary. A lot of this information is captured from patient diary, but they also reported the outcomes at 24 and 28 or 48 weeks post-activation. So those were kind of what the study intended to do. This is sort of how the study played out. The consort diagram, about 183 patients came into the study, and we got about 120 of those patients to the endpoints. 132 were actually, from an intent to treat perspective, implanted. And then you can kind of see some fallout here. Either infection was a common one, and then losing information. I'm not privy exactly how those fallouts happened, but from a technical perspective, there were a couple patients that needed MRI. And you look at that coin device, and as an engineer, you go, well, why couldn't you put this in an MRI? And your answer is it could be done in an MRI. The problem is it's about $500,000 to test it for MRI, and that wasn't something that we were at Valencia prepared to do initially. But I have full confidence that this device will be an MRI compatible device someday. It's just a matter of making that investment. But we did lose through the study some patients in that. The demographics, probably the most notable thing is almost all these patients were white females. And this is because a lot of these centers were women's health centers that were specialized in treatment of urinary incontinence and the problems associated with that. And so naturally the patient selection kind of ran into that group. The average age was about 64 years old. And then for baseline episodes, these patients typically had 4.3 voiding episodes mean, and ranging from 1 to 23. You can kind of read the chart there. There was a separate group of patients that were analyzed, and we'll look at that as a secondary endpoint, where we looked at patients that had more than 10 episodes per day, because that was a different group that we wanted to look at. And then in terms of how bothered the patients were, they, on a scale of 1 to 100, and with the way we scored it, they were at about a 66 to start with. In terms of quality of life, where we want that number to be high, they were sitting at about 45.7 average with a range, well, I guess we didn't give the range, but plus or minus 22.3. So kind of in the middle of that range. So the endpoints were geared at sort of seeing how the quality of life and the symptom bother, how the patients felt about the device. And then for prior therapies, every one of these patients had failed a prior treatment or had a prior treatment that they hadn't seen. About 26% had undergone PTNS, few transcutaneous, 85%, almost all of them had OAB medications, 11% Botox. There were some other treatments that they were intolerant of, but again, none of them had not gone through prior treatment. The washout for this, if they were on OAB pharmaceuticals, there was a 2-week washout minimum, PTNS a 1-month washout, and for the Botox, at least a 9-month washout. We didn't include patients that had sacral nerve modulation, so we didn't really have that group in here. And then if they did need to get OAB therapy, other OAB therapies, we didn't preclude that, but they were expected to avoid that. And if they did, we would log that information and analyze it separately. And then these are the results. The endpoint, at the endpoint, which is the percentage of patients that achieved 50% reduction in voiding, there were 68% of these patients that were included that achieved that. So, pretty typical for tibial nerve stimulation in terms of how it performs if you compare it to other PTNS studies. And again, this is with an implanted device. Some of the secondary endpoints, you can see a little over 40% of the patients experienced a 75% reduction in UII. There were actually almost 20% of the patients at week 48 were still experienced a 100% reduction. So again, these are not unusual results. If you go into the literature and look at PTNS, this is not atypical. The secondary endpoints, and I know this is an eye chart, again, the paper is there, you can look at, but typically, and this is consistent with what was seen in the feasibility, you saw a reduction of around 2 or 3 episodes at 48 weeks, and that carried over back to 24 weeks. So the durability of this looks pretty good in terms of sustaining at least out through a year. Similar for voids, the average, now some patients had more, some had fewer, but on average, they saw a reduction. The urinary voids, what's shown there as an asterisk, is a special group of patients. This is a group that includes folks that had more than 10 voids a day. So if you kind of take that group out separately, those 54 participants, you see that they do, similar to what the other cohort does. Again, around a 2 to 3 reduction in the number of voids a day, and a moderate reduction in nocturia and urgency episodes. So in terms of the quality of life scores, you can kind of see that at the baseline, these patients were sitting at, I think, around 47 or 50. So we saw a reduction in about 30% or an increase in 30% in those scores, and the symptom, they dropped by a similar amount, about 30%. So, kind of headed in the right direction there. And then the assessments, most of the patients would say that they were very satisfied, or at least towards somewhat satisfied on average. But we had patients that didn't like the therapy, and patients that thought it was, they were completely satisfied. So again, that's sort of the net of it. So let's talk a little bit then about some of the adverse events for this device on the safety endpoints. There were 26 patients that had adverse events, 3 of them with what were considered severe. In order, the most prevalent problem were infections. This is not atypical, again, for any implant. There were only 2% of the infections, or 2 infections, that required the device to be explanted. And if you kind of look at this against other implantable devices, 2% is not bad. 3 to 6% is sort of the going rate for a lot of neuromodulation applications that are subcutaneously, or that require subcutaneous incision. The different issues range from post-op wound infection and then implant site infection itself. The next on the list of adverse event were product issues. Stimulation issues led that discomfort or issues with the stimulation that the patient had. Only one of them was severe enough, considered severe. Dislocation of the device. So, if you had a lead that could move, the device can move. We had 2 of these that were mild dislocations. I don't think they were significant enough to affect the therapy, but they were notable for mild. And we had 1 device that did fail. I believe that was a premature depletion on one of the devices. So all in all, not totally atypical, and not something that I would be extremely concerned about, other than as engineers, we always want to do better. Wound dehiscence and arrhythmia and pain, and that was another set. So there were some discomforts associated with the device. There was pain in the extremity, and implant site swelling, discomfort around that. There was 1 patient that had dermatitis, contact dermatitis, and skin irritation. It was another. So that kind of sums up the types of adverse events that are tied to the equine. Not something that I think would worry me as a biomedical engineer in terms of how the device is performing. So the conclusions out of this, the leadless stimulation with a coin-sized self-powered implant, it's safe. It does meet the primary efficacy outcomes for treatment of urgency urinary incontinence. It has a well-tolerated and a reproducible implant procedure that can be done in an outpatient or a brief office, and it only requires local anesthesia. There are minimal compliance requirements for aftercare for a device like this. So once you activate it, there's not much to do for device management, and so that helps how this device might fit into the treatment tier. And that's everything I had. I kind of talked a little fast, maybe too fast, but so I apologize for that, but I'll open it up now for questions.
Thanks, Dave. I think you paced it just right. So we can go ahead and if you want to raise your hand, you can raise your hand. If people just want to speak up, they can go ahead and speak up. I'll try and moderate if too many people want to talk at once.
Hi, Dave. This is Dominique.
Hi, Dominique.
How are you?
Really good.
Nice to see you. I haven't seen you for a long, long time.
It's been a while.
I do have a question about your endpoints. I can't remember exactly what it was. 50% reduction in
Yes.
How many patients?
So let's kind of pop back to that. So the endpoint itself was what percentage of the patients could we achieve a 50% reduction in UUI episodes at 48 weeks? And what was achieved in the study was that after 48 weeks,
Wait, I'm not getting that. It's for 50% reduction in, did you have a number of responders if you wanted to?
Yeah, this is no, we did not. That's a great point.
Oh, we did not.
Yeah, we did not. We just said we will evaluate the endpoint based on the responder rate, and we consider a responder to be those patients that have 50% reduction. Yeah.
And the FDA was okay with that?
They were. Well, I mean, I won't speak for FDA, but this is a study that we were able to do, and
Gotcha,
yeah.
And this 50%, that was from a clinical point of view. In other words, you heard that number from clinicians, or there's something you guys decided on? How was that decided on?
So Valencia, this study was executed by a third-party CRO, at least the data analysis was. So, and it was based on patient diary information. So it was, there was a procedure where the data was analyzed, and there was an assessment made of the data as to what the reduction rate was. And then each patient would have that, but it was principally based on diary information.
No, I'm asking, how did you decide on 50% earlier as an endpoint? Was that your decision, or was it from the clinicians decided, okay, this will be best for the patient?
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously 100% reduction would be the best, but what would be reasonable that, there's a trade-off when you undergo a procedure and have an implant placed wherein you might be comfortable having an implant if you could know what your chances are of having your the reduction in UI episodes. And so 50% was sort of chosen, yes, as kind of a clinically meaningful level. And then again, we did have secondary endpoints around what you would see for 75 and 100%. I think if you were making a decision as a patient and a clinician as to whether you were going to get a device like that, that would sort of weigh into, my chances of seeing a 50% reduction in episodes, around 60%, 60, 70%, that would weigh into the calculus of whether you would receive the device. But I think, Dominique, that the idea of that 50% reduction is worth considering for this implant. That sort of went into the thinking as to why this endpoint was chosen.
Good, thanks.
I have a few folks with hands up. Maybe we can take Megan and then Warren and then Nathan.
Right. Sure.
Thanks, Dave, for an excellent presentation. My question has to do with the future commercialization strategy that you would see for this product. Would this fit into the same paradigm as other devices in terms of the reimbursement strategy that you would use? Is it likely that it would get the same reimbursement level as other existing products?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's something that Valencia, I know, has been working on in terms of how they would do it. They've been working with the AMA as well for getting some information on how they would classify it. I know that's been an important step, and it's going to go in principally around what a peripheral neural stimulator would go in as. So that's sort of the range that they're going to that they're saying. I can't say a whole lot more about that, Megan, but that's sort of the approach that's being looked at. And next question.
You want to go, Warren?
Yeah, thanks so much. Dave, great to see you. Finally figured out how to operate Zoom after 2 years here. So one of the promises of this implant relative to percutaneous tibial nerve stimulation is the ability for patients to receive a much larger dose of stimulation, right? They can stimulate all day, every day if they want, or 8 hours a day, every day if they want. And yet the effects that you see, if I understand correctly, are comparable to what someone gets after once a week, 1 hour sessions at the PT&S salon.
Yes. And
so I'm surprised that you don't see more dramatic effects. And I'm wondering if you guys have thought about why that might be.
No, it's a really good question. And it kind of gets right at the trade-offs that you're making in getting a device of this size and form factor. In fact, the paradigm that we deliver is identical to what you would get within office visits, Warren. It's the 30 minutes every 3 days for 18 weeks, followed by 30 minutes every 4 days. So it is a little on the aggressive side. I don't know that patients would go in every third day, typically from a compliance perspective, but it's really designed to replicate what you might get under optimal conditions for a PT&S where you were going into the office. And you go, well, why is that? Why don't you just turn it on all the day? You could. The trade-off there is the device couldn't be so small. Right now, the device is about 1.3 cc's. It's dominated by the battery at this point. If you wanted more therapy, you could do that. The question is how much bigger could the implant be? And that's to be determined. Like if we figured out that daily doses made more sense and that justified making the implant bigger, we could do that. But where we chose was a spot that would replicate at least what you could get under optimal in-office PT&S therapy.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Nathan?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I'm not sure if I missed it when you were describing it, but could you comment on the extraction process when you need to remove the device?
Oh yeah, I didn't actually do that at all. So the explant procedure would involve an incision and then going into the pocket. These are coin-shaped devices. You don't have leads to extract. I actually wished I had some of the information that Dr. Sen had, because we do look at the explant procedure, but it would be an incision and a removal of a coin-shaped device.
So is it the opening at where the original incision was, and then you, I don't know if dig in is the right word, but then dig in, or is the incision right over where the piece is? Because you said that it gets sort of pushed into the pocket.
Yeah, Nathan, I actually don't know the actual answer to that. Subaru Sen, who developed the procedure, I know that he thought about the explant and to whether he would use the incision above, kind of recut that incision or go down to the pocket. Remember, these are devices that will have to be replaced, so I'm sure it's been thought of. And if I were to guess, and I'm only guessing here, I would think that you'd go back and do the original incision.
That makes sense if they're getting replaced. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Aiden has a question for you, Dave.
Great.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I was just curious, what are the sensations that those patients are receiving when the stimulation is on? You mentioned that they were able to tell when it was on.
Yeah, and I didn't talk about that. So typically when you assess whether you're getting target engagement with the tibial nerve is you look at the motor reflex and you'll see kind of a toe reflex. So they'll use that. So the patient, I would imagine, would feel that. Now, the stimulation, you don't want a patient being uncomfortable, and you saw that there were some adverse events where the patients were having problems with the stimulation where it had to be adjusted. So you would dial it down to where they were comfortable. And obviously the question is remember, this is an ambulatory patient. It's, kind of going about their daily life. You don't want that interfering with them. So it would be set. They would feel probably the tingling down in the lower limb. They'd feel it in the sole of the foot. They might even get a little bit of motor on that. And so that's what it would feel like to the patient. And that's when we implant and activate the device, that's actually how that's done. Great. That's a good question. Thanks for bringing that up.
Dave, we have a question from Steve Majerus, he says he's suffering from slow Wi-Fi, so he put the question by chat. What other peripheral applications are you considering?
Oh, wow.
Pain?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. So I think I mentioned earlier, when we started this adventure at Valencia, we actually built a technology to look at median nerve stimulation for hypertension, and actually did conduct a feasibility trial. And the interest in that type of therapy, once renal ablation sort of went by the wayside because we were going to be part of that spectrum, really went away, and so the funding wasn't there. So the company pivoted to tibial nerve stimulation, where there, as you can see, kind of an established set of therapies that this sort of fits into. But there are other things that this could be used for. Anything that you might entertain peripheral nerve stimulation with a subcutaneous device could be, where the nerve is accessible. It's been looked at. People have talked about depression. As I mentioned, blood pressure is another one. I've even had folks talk about whether this could be used for incontinence. I mean, not incontinence, sexual dysfunction. Some of the same candidates at tibial nerve. Obviously, there's other things. Fecal incontinence is another one that you could look at. There's a whole list of them that you could maybe apply this technology to. But again, the secret to making something really work and apply to patients is you kind of need to find a clinical set of tiering where the device sort of fits in. Orphan devices just are really tough to get there, because you've got to find a clinical interest in it. You have to have folks that are willing to be trained and to manage them and take the device forward. I don't know if that really answered your question, but yes, there are other applications.
Dave, I have a question or two for you. In spinal cord stimulation, one of the virtues of that therapy is that there's a trial procedure. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if the PTNS serves as a trial here, or could serve as a trial, or how you're thinking about.
That's a great question. I think it could, and it may be that some clinicians would prefer to see how the patient does with PTNS before proceeding to the implant. So I think that is reasonable. We didn't do this. You could see this study didn't involve a trial. These patients were screened and then implanted. So you're looking kind of at a naive population, but you certainly could do a better job maybe of screening for effective therapy, maybe get that responder rate up by doing something like that. I will say that this, I don't know this for a fact, but if you look at kind of the prior therapies, a lot of these patients had undergone PTNS.
But it wasn't an inclusion criteria for them to have done it, or to have been effective.
Yeah, no, it was not. But if you wanted to do like a retrospective analysis on that, you probably could assess how those 26% that had prior PTNS did with this device relative to that, and if they were a different cohort.
That was great.
Yeah.
Dominique has another question for you.
Yes.
Yeah, Dave. So this is sort of a new Bion, right? It's a different design of the Bion ID.
It is in a lot of ways. Yeah.
What's so different about it? The shape is different, but why is it that this one worked and sort of looks like it's working well, but the Bion didn't? And yet it's the same basic idea: floating stimulator near a nerve.
Yeah. I'm not so sure. Well, the Bion, as you know, its form factor was more of a cylindrical form factor. And in some of its embodiments, it requires external power. A lot of the targets that the Bion went after, you may recall that its implant procedure required access to the pudendal nerve. I believe it was the pudendal nerve. So that procedure was a different. And what really sort of stopped the Bion in that case was, how do you get the device out? Whereas this, we're finding sites that are subcutaneous, peripheral. And the Bion was never really, I mean, you certainly could use the Bion as a peripheral nerve stimulator if you wanted, but it was more thought of as a deeper implant, trying to get closer to the end target. So I think a little bit, the way the Bion worked, it was challenging because of where it ended up being implanted and then the difficulty with getting it out. And it might have been ahead of its time. A lot of these therapies that are now being handled at women's health centers for incontinence, they may not have been as mature at the time the Bion came out. I'm speculating on that, Dominique, but
So one idea I had when you were talking is that the Bion, I think, was pretty sensitive to problems with location.
Yeah.
If it moved a little bit, whereas your device seems to be rather insensitive by design, because even if you move it a little bit, right, you still, as long as you stay in the profile of the coin size, it will work. Am I right on this one, or?
You are exactly right. I mean, that was by design. We said, let's make this thing it is limited to subcutaneous applications. You don't want to be putting it too deep. It's not the radial symmetry of it means all you need to do is get the cathode over the target centered, and you can't put it off to the side, but if you can get that over the nerve, you're gonna get a pretty good activation. Yes, it is. Whereas a lot of these cylindrical geometries, the fields are not they're not your friends when you're trying to get them over a nerve. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
There's a question from FWM. I'm sorry, I don't. If you can introduce yourself and ask a question.
Hey, Dave. This is Fred Montague, and
hi, Fred.
nice device. And in looking at it and realizing that the therapy is so intermittent, and the battery takes up a huge amount of space, did you? Is there a reason that you didn't or couldn't make it a passive device with such a big external charger anyhow?
Yeah.
And such an intermittent use, so you could avoid a lot of surgeries and infection issues.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it kind of comes down to the way we packaged this device. If I needed to get power into it, I would have needed a coil. So we probably would have had about the same size device that we would be implanting. So at the end of the day, an RF powered device that would require the patient to wear a device or actually power the device externally would end up probably being about the same size or bigger. Just to be clear, the external controller that goes with this device is only used when you are activating the device. It's a temporary, so it's a one-time deal where you turn on the unit, set the amplitude, and then you don't have to mess with it anymore. The patient does get a magnet if they run into problems and they need to turn their device off. But there really is, it is truly, once you activate it, there's no patient interaction with the system really needed as far as programming and adjusting the device, which is, there are a lot of patients that we found in other applications that really appreciate that. They really don't want to be messing with programmers and devices that control their therapies. Other patients do appreciate that, and they might, being more active in a therapy that uses an RF powered system might actually work for them better. But I don't think there would be any advantages with an RF powered embodiment of this system. in terms of size and infection rate and so forth.
Thanks.
Dave, I have maybe one last question. I'm piggybacking a little bit on what Aiden asked you about and what the patients feel. I'm curious how how much work has been done to kind of understand parameter sensitivities. For example, the lifetime between 6 hertz versus 20 hertz would be pretty different, as an example. Or the amplitude, you said that the patient feels it, sometimes even may get some motor effects associated with stimulation. Is that needed for therapy? I'm wondering if maybe you can turn it down. We've seen some interesting things on the spinal cord stim side.
Yeah.
And associated with that, I wonder if some of these patients still have battery left, and the Valencia team could do some exploratory work to try and tackle some of these questions using those same patients.
I think so. As you saw, there was a follow-on study for the feasibility. I'm not privy to exactly what Valencia has in mind. I'm not that close to what goes on there, but certainly you could do that. In terms of the battery life trade-off, there definitely was a conscious decision because we wanted to make sure we could get a baseline efficacy to work towards the high end of what we knew would work. So that's where 20 pulses per second was selected. It was sort of at the higher end of it. But if we started to look at throttling that back, you could start to do that and maybe get the longevity up. As you can see, it's still a 3-year device. It's not, if you look in the field for other implants, 3 years it's kind of on the short end. But yes, I think you could start to do some of those studies, see if you can get the information. As you can see, because of these types of responder rates, you need some pretty big numbers to really see whether there's a difference. But I agree. And definitely the parameters that were chosen were towards the high end.
Thanks, Dave. Are there any last questions?
I do, yeah. I forgot one thing. I did want to acknowledge some folks. I just realized I didn't do that. So I just wanted to make sure I recognized a lot of the people that went into this. So some of the folks at Valencia Technologies, including Jeff Greiner, who founded this company, and my partner, Chula Fenuara, who's in mechanical design, and the COO, Stacy, and then all the clinical trial investigators. I wanted to recognize them. And then we talked about Subaru, and we talked about some of the team that's helped with the surgical development, the training, and Justin Klein actually did all the illustrations. He does them for our manuals and these illustrations. I did want to acknowledge them. Sorry for missing that. Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Any last questions for Dave? Well, Dave, we really appreciate you spending the afternoon with us and teaching us more about some of the work that you're doing.
Well, I really appreciate the feedback and the opportunity to talk, and I hope to maybe be back to talk about some other things some other day. But thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Dave,
Hi,
very
Dave.
much. Really great. Really great. Thanks.
Thank you.